There are some people who become known for something they never quite chose. Not because they announced it, not because they built it deliberately, but because, over time, the same small pattern repeats often enough that it begins to look like identity. They're a bit distant. They're very intense. They're hard to read. They overthink things. They don't care as much. The descriptions vary. The tone changes depending on who is speaking, but the effect is similar. A shape begins to form around the person, not entirely inaccurate, but not entirely true either. The person who was always misunderstood didn't notice it at first. How could they? From the inside, everything felt consistent. Their thoughts made sense to them. Their reactions felt appropriate. Their silence, when it came, felt natural rather than deliberate. But from the outside, something else was happening. It would show up in small moments. A conversation where they answered honestly, only to realize later that the room had shifted in a way they didn't expect. A message they sent with care that was received as cold. A pause they took to think that was read as disinterest. Nothing dramatic. No arguments, no confrontations, just small misalignments. At first, they assumed it was coincidence. Different people, different moods, different contexts. It happens. But patterns, when they repeat quietly, begin to leave traces. Someone once said lightly, "You're hard to read." It wasn't said as criticism, more like an observation, but it lingered. Not because it was offensive, because it was unfamiliar. Hard to read. From the inside, they felt completely readable. Their thoughts were structured. Their feelings, though not always loudly expressed, were present. They weren't hiding anything. They simply weren't displaying everything. And somewhere in that difference, the gap began. Misunderstanding doesn't usually arrive all at once. It builds gradually. A small interpretation here, an assumption there, a moment where something is left unexplained, not out of secrecy, but because explaining it feels unnecessary. Until eventually, a version of you exists in other people's minds that you don't quite recognize. It doesn't feel like being judged. It feels more like being translated, but slightly inaccurately. The person who was always misunderstood began to notice it more clearly over time. Not in what people said directly, but in how they responded. Someone would soften their words around them as if expecting distance. Someone else would explain things more than necessary, as if assuming confusion. Another would hesitate before sharing something emotional, as though unsure how it would be received. Each response made sense on its own, but together they pointed to something. A quiet difference between intention and interpretation. It wasn't always negative. Sometimes people assumed strengths that weren't quite accurate either. You're so independent. You don't need anyone. You're always fine. These sounded like compliments, but they carried the same quiet distance. Because being seen as independent is not the same as being understood. Being seen as calm is not the same as being connected. Being seen as fine is not the same as being asked. And the strange part was this. The person who was always misunderstood didn't feel invisible. They felt partially seen, like a photograph that captured the outline but not the depth. They began to wonder when it had started, not in a dramatic defining moment, but in the accumulation of small choices. Moments when they chose not to explain something because it felt obvious. Moments when they let a misinterpretation pass because correcting it felt too heavy. Moments when they prioritized ease over precision. Because explaining yourself repeatedly takes energy, not just the energy of words, but the energy of translating something internal into something another person can recognize. And sometimes it feels easier to let the approximation stand. They think I'm quiet. Close enough. They think I don't mind. Not entirely wrong. They think I'm distant. That one depends. So the pattern continues, not because it is chosen, but because it is allowed. There is also another layer, a quieter one. Sometimes people don't just misunderstand because something wasn't explained. Sometimes they misunderstand because they are interpreting through their own lens. Someone who values constant communication may read silence as withdrawal. Someone who expresses care through words may miss care that appears through presence. Someone who needs visible reassurance may not recognize quiet steadiness as support. In that sense, misunderstanding is not always a failure. Sometimes it is simply a difference in language. The person who was always misunderstood began to see this more clearly, not as blame, not as frustration, just as structure. People don't see you as you are, they see you as they are able to see. And that ability is shaped by their experiences, their expectations, their emotional vocabulary. Which means that even if you explain yourself perfectly every time, something would still be interpreted. At first, this realization felt slightly unsettling because it removed a certain kind of control. If understanding is shared, then being fully understood is not something one person can guarantee. For a while, the person considered changing, not dramatically, just small adjustments, explaining more, clarifying tone, adding extra words where silence might be misread. Sometimes it helped. The gap narrowed. The responses shifted slightly. But something else appeared too, a quiet fatigue. Because when you constantly translate yourself, you begin to feel slightly removed from the original thought, like you are speaking a version of yourself that is easier to receive, rather than the one that naturally occurs. And that raises a quieter question. At what point does being understood require becoming different? The person didn't have a clear answer, so instead of choosing one direction, they began to notice. When did misunderstanding matter? When did it not? When was it worth explaining? When was it easier or even more honest to let the interpretation exist? Because not every misunderstanding creates distance. Some pass through without consequence. Some are corrected naturally over time. And some remain, quietly shaping how people see you. There were moments still when it surfaced more strongly. A conversation where someone said, "I thought you didn't care about that." A pause, a small internal shift, because they did care, just not in the way that had been expected. And in that moment, they could choose, explain, or let it stand. Sometimes they explained gently without urgency. "I do care," they said. "I just don't always show it in obvious ways." Other times they let it pass, not out of resignation, but out of acceptance that not every perception needs to be corrected. Because something else had become clear. Being misunderstood is not always a problem to solve. Sometimes it is simply a condition of being seen at all. To be known by others is to be interpreted, and interpretation by its nature is never exact. The person who was always misunderstood didn't become someone who explained everything. They didn't become someone who withdrew completely either. They remained themselves, but with a small shift in awareness. They no longer assumed that being clear internally meant being clear externally. They no longer assumed that silence would be understood as intention. They no longer assumed that others would naturally arrive at the same meaning. And at the same time, they stopped expecting perfect understanding in return. Not because it wasn't valuable, but because it wasn't always possible, which left them in a different kind of space. One where connection wasn't built on perfect accuracy, but on a willingness from both sides to move closer to understanding, even if it never fully arrived. And in that space, something softened. Not the misunderstandings themselves, those still happened, but the weight of them. Because they were no longer carrying the expectation that every version of them in every mind needed to match exactly. Which leaves the question hanging, not inside the story, but outside it, with you. Have you ever felt understood in one moment and completely misread in another? When someone misunderstands you, do you feel the need to correct it, or do you sometimes let it stand? Are we responsible for making ourselves understood? And how much of who we are exists in the space between intention and interpretation?